Okay, today we're going to be looking at selection. And selection is basically what we use when we are looking at decisions. Do you want something to happen or do you not want something to happen? If this is true, then do this, otherwise do this. Anytime you have a decision to make in a program, you're going to be using some sort of selection statement. Now we're going to start off with some very basic selection statements, but I want to move on and do some more advanced selection statements later. But for today, or for right now, we're just going to do some very basic selection statements. So again, as we talked about, if statements are used when the program has to make a decision, you could actually compare an if statement, which is the type of selection statement that we're going to be using in Visual Basic, to an actual if statement in English. So you can see the example here. If I raise my hand in the class, then the class will stand. Um, there's a condition associated with that. So every if statement has a condition. Okay? And that condition has to be met, or it has to be true if it's met. So if I raise my hand, then the raising of my hand is the condition. If I do raise my hand, then that condition is true. If I don't raise my hand, then that condition will result in a false statement. So syntax is, again, keep in mind the idea that syntax is how we write things. It's kind of the grammar rules for writing the different lines of code in Visual Basic or in any programming language. So the syntax for an if statement is the keyword if, whatever your condition is in some kind of comparison statement, and then the keyword then. Below that, you will write all of the statements that you want to perform should the condition return true. So these statements will only occur if our condition returns true. So somewhere up here we're going to have a condition, we have a then, and then we perform these statements. And then you'll notice at the end you have an end if. And that's pretty important because for every if statement, you will always have an associated end if. You will always see an end if with an if, or you have to have an end if with an if. Here's a simple example of how that works. There's the keyword if to open up our if statement. Age is less than 16, so it checks to see if the variable age is less than 16. If it is, then it will go right into our statement here, which is txt drive.text is equal to I'm sorry you cannot drive. Then the if is ended. And again, note, you've got your if there and your end if here. The other thing you should notice about the if statement syntax, and it's shown again here in the example, is that once your if statement is put out, then you have to tab in the sections here. So you'll notice here that I've tabbed in all the statements that belong to this if condition. So if this if condition is true, then you're going to indent all of the statements that associate with that index. And you can see that here. Here's the if that tests. The statement here is indented. And then down here you have your end if, which comes back in line with your if. So you can almost see that there's kind of a line that's drawn here, and we indent any statements inside of the if statement, and we keep the if and end if on the outside. So that's what we do if we have a very simple if statement. If a condition is true, then perform some sort of statements. Otherwise, just continue on with any code that might actually happen below this. But what if we want a more complex statement? So what if we want it to do one thing if the statement is true and a different thing if the condition is false? And this is a little bit more complex if statement, and this if statement is called a if-else statement. And you can see the syntax for an if-else statement. It looks fairly similar to the if statement. The only difference is we add in the keyword else here. Okay, so this add-in of the keyword else gives us an opportunity to put statements in that we would like to perform if this condition returns true. So again, the syntax is the same. You have an if, and then you have a then, and then these statements get performed if this returns true, and then your else shows up, and these statements get performed if it returns false. And again, notice, again, you must have an and if with every if. Also note the indenting, and note that the if, the else, and the end if all run along the same line. So here's an example here. So our test condition here is age less than 16. It's the same condition that we had in our last slide. So if age is less than 16, if it is, then we go in here, and if it's true, we perform this statement here. If it's false, however, now it's going to perform this statement. So if they're under 16, we want it to say, you may not drive. Otherwise, we want it to say, you may drive. So anyone under the age of 16 can't drive, but then anybody over the age of 16 does have the ability to drive. And again, you can see the indenting and everything else associated with a proper if statement. Okay, let's go one step further and go even more complex. So what happens if you have several conditions that you need to test? And a good example of that is, let's say we were developing some software for a company that provides cell phone plans. So if we're providing this software, remember that each plan requires you to pay a different fee. There's different benefits to having each plan. You get different services depending on the plan that you pay for. So it would be nice if we could include all those options into one statement instead of creating several different simple if statements. We'd like to be able to create that all in one. And you can do that. And in order to include multiple conditions, you have to use an else if statement. And yes, else if is one word. And I know that looks a little bit weird, but that's the way the syntax works in Visual Basic. So again, looking very similar to our original if statement, you have your opening if, a condition, a then statement, and then any statements that you would like to occur if that condition is true. The difference here is that now, instead of saying else, you use else if, put a new condition in place, another then statement, and then any of the statements you'd like if that condition is true. Okay. Then another else if statement, and you can do this as many times as you want. You can have as many else ifs as you want. If that condition is true, then perform these statements. This else statement here, this else statement determines, and if none of these conditions return true, so if this condition is false, if this condition is false, and if this condition is false, it will jump to this else command and it will perform these statements. And it's, so basically, if all else fails here, if all else fails, then we're going to perform this here. And then again, notice the alignment here. You've got your if, you've got your else if, you've got your else and your end if, all lined up along the same kind of tab. And then everything else, all the statements belonging to each one of those blocks of code are tabbed in. And here's an example of that. This is the best example I can think of. Right, so in this example, you've got, again, your if statement. If grade is greater than or equal to 90, then we want the letter grade to equal A+. So this is a simple letter grade test. So basically, based on the average that a student gets, it will test that, and then based on that condition, it will assign a certain letter grade based on the value. So if you get over or 90 or above, you're going to end up with an A+. If you get 80 or above, you're going to get an A. 70 to 80 is B, 60 in the 60s is C, and the 50s is D, and anything else is a fail. And we assign the letter grade F for that. So if grade is greater than or equal to 90, then the letter is equal to A+. So if this condition returns true, then you're going to assign A+ to the letter. Then here's your else if. Else if the grade is greater than or equal to 80, then letter equals A. Else if the grade is greater than or equal to 70, letter equals B. Else if grade is greater than or equal to 60, the letter is C, and so on down the list. So you can see how, depending on the average that the student has received, it will assign the proper letter grade, and that condition is written every single time. In this else statement down at the bottom, remember we talked about this if all else fails or if all else is false. then perform this. So if none of these conditions true, meaning conditions are true, sorry, meaning that the student has never or has not received any of these grade categories, then we're going to assign the letter F. And then you've got your end if statement at the end as well. And again, keeping in mind this idea that everything is kind of along the same line here, and then all your statements are tabbed inside the block of code, inside the else if statement or the else statement. And for every if, you have a corresponding end if. The last type of if statement I want to take a look at today is a nested if statement. And a nested if statement is basically a decision inside of a decision. And I like to use the example of trying to decide what I'm going to have for lunch. So if we're trying to decide what we have to lunch, maybe we might ask ourselves the first question, would I like a sandwich for lunch? And that's the first decision. If I would like a sandwich for lunch, then I'm going to go inside and then determine the type of sandwich I want. But if I don't want a sandwich for lunch, I don't want to have to look at all this stuff and decide what kind of sandwich I want because I know I don't want a sandwich. So then I'm going to go to continue that first decision. Okay, else if, would I like soup? This would be your else if statement. So do I want soup? And then there would be selections inside there that would determine whether I wanted soup. So if I do want my sandwich though, next thing I got to do is I have to go inside that statement and I have to check to see which kind of sandwich I want. So would I like peanut butter? If yes, then make my peanut butter sandwich. Else I would like a ham sandwich, make a ham sandwich, end if. So this if statement here is inside of the outside if statement. So you have an outside if statement out here. And we call this a nested if statement, an if statement inside of an if statement. And you can see here's an example of the syntax of a nested if statement. So here's my opening if, and here's the end if for that if. So that's why, again, tabbing becomes important, because the if needs to line up with your end if. Now, when we look at this, if we want to go and look at this other if, our nested if statement, or our if statement that's inside of the other if statement, shows here, and here's the end if for that. So these two line up. So we know that anything inside of this is tabbed in, but then also we have another if statement, so inside that you have this tabbing as well. So this is just basically an if statement inside of another if statement. If this condition is true, then go check. Then we want to perform these statements, but then inside that there's another test. Check to see if this is true. So tabbing, this is where tabbing becomes really important because it will really play a huge role in what your end product looks like. Now, if statements are considered Boolean expressions because they always must return a true or false result. And you can think of that decision structure back when we were looking at flowcharting. You remember if we had, if x is equal to y here, and there was always two results here. You could either have yes, or you could have no, or true and false. That's the only way the computer knows how to make decisions. You can't decide between two things other than a true or a false result. So in order to create these Boolean expressions, we need to know how to use relational operators. And relational operators are just operators that allow you to compare each other. So you already know about mathematical operators. Those are operators that allow you to do mathematical equations. But we also have to then look at relational operators. And these are the different relational operators that are used in Visual Basic. If you want to compare to see if two things are equal to one another, you simply put an equal sign in between them. Less than is your less than sign. And if you can, go back to your beginning days of elementary school, you can remember about the crocodile and, which direction is the crocodile's mouth. And that's, one of the ways we learn how to figure out it's less than. So Less than runs this way. Less than or equal to is the less than and equal sign put together. Greater than is the opposite direction, greater than or equal to. And then you can see that there's a not equal symbol, which is less than, greater than put together. Note that it cannot look like this. You cannot put the two symbols together like this. This does not work. Okay, can't use that. In order to use the not equal to, you have to have less than, greater than arranged like this. Okay, now that's it for our if statement lesson, or our first selection statement. There are other ways to do selection statements. There are other ways that you can write or make decisions, sorry, in Visual Basic, and we'll look at those later. For now, it's just important that you learn the different types of if statements.